far north of Russia, scene of a military intervention at the tail end of the First World War, when Allied troops fought Russian soldiers on Russian soil. Can Britain's present tensions with Russia be traced to those far-off days? We're sailing down the river Dwina in North Russia to investigate one of the darkest episodes of a conflict which took place nearly a century ago. This story begins in Arkhangelsk, or Archangel, Russia's first commercial port on the White Sea, nearly 1,000 kilometers north of Moscow. It was founded in the 16th century by Ivan the Terrible. Locals describe their city in 3 words: Treska, Daska, Taska, cod, wood and melancholy. Imperial Russia under Tsar Nicholas II was on the side of Britain and France in World War I and against the Germans. But after 3 long years, Russians were sick of fighting. Almost every family suffered the loss of a father, a brother or a son. In February 1917, hundreds of thousands took to the streets of Russia's then capital, Petrograd, demanding bread and peace. Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. His family was taken into custody and eventually shot by the revolutionary government. The late Scottish-Russian writer Yevgenia Fraser, who spent her childhood in Archangel, was a witness to what happened in her town at the outset of the 1917 Russian Revolution. The daughter of a well-to-do timber merchant, she saw at first hand the changes when the Reds took over.
At that time, I was going on my 12th year. On my way to school, I noticed a group of men carrying flags and singing revolutionary songs. Our headmistress announced, she said, "Girls, from now on there won't be any more singing of our national anthem." And as we glanced at the wall where only the day before were seen the portraits of our Russian royal family, and now were only blanks, we realized that a new era had commenced. And that was the start of the first, what was known as a democratic revolution under the ruling of Kerensky. But by October, Lenin's communists took over.
In March 1918, the Bolshevik leader Lenin ratified the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty with Germany. Russia was out of the war and would no longer defend against German attacks. The Allies decided to launch a war of intervention, ostensibly to reactivate the Eastern Front. Some foreign troops went to the south and the far east of Russia. From the outset, Winston Churchill, Secretary of State for War under British Prime Minister Lloyd George, was the driving force behind the intervention into Russia.
Churchill is obsessed with Bolshevism and talks about strangling the baby of Bolshevism in its cradle, and talks a language of viruses and vials of poison. All this very, very overheated rhetoric, but it does seem that he really believed that Bolshevism was a movement that could undermine the whole of civilization.
Eventually, a multinational force of up to 30,000 American, French, Canadian and British soldiers were based in North Russia under British command. The first big contingent of Allied troops sailed into Archangel on August 2nd, 1918.
All the ships coming in from the White Sea, from all the different countries came into that channel and came out suddenly into view. And that is what happened during the time of the Allied intervention. The Americans, the French, they were all there. And they sailed on right past in front of our house, you know. Some of my relatives were sitting on the balcony. It was a tremendous sight because they stretched right out. And everybody, of course, was cheering from here, and they were cheering back to us.
When the Allies first arrived, people were actually welcoming them because during the 4 years of the First World War, they were accustomed to propaganda that the Allies were standing on the side of Russia in that war. That's why many of them didn't support the Red Order to mobilize into the army to fight the Allies together with Germans. And many Northerners were expecting that when the Allies come, they will help the local population with food, for example, because there was shortage of food supply in this non-agricultural province, that the Allies will bring peace, not war.
Despite the official narrative against the intervention in Soviet times, not all the local memories of the Allies were negative.
Своей бабушки слышала рассказы. В детстве я была пионеркой. Я считала, что красное – это хорошо, белое – это плохо, интервенты – это плохо. И моя бабушка, она мне говорила так: да ты что, англичане в нашу деревню приехали, белую муку привезли, нас конфетами угощали и кормили. Я говорю: бабушка, не может быть, они же враги.
Ordinary soldiers from Britain, France, Canada and the US were told their mission was to protect military stores and stop the Germans from establishing a submarine base in the north. So they were astonished to soon find themselves fighting on the side of moderate whites against the Reds, the Bolsheviks, in Russia's nascent civil war.
There was a lot of dissatisfaction among the Allied troops because many of the Allied soldiers expected to see Germans here helping the Bolsheviks, and they didn't see any.
Britain never formally went to war in Russia. This was a kind of intervention by stealth, and that people gradually woke up to the scale of this intervention.
The man who led the Allied intervention in North Russia was General Edmund Ironside. His 94-year-old son lives in Hampshire in the south of England.
This other picture then shows him in the sleigh setting off on one of his trips.
He shows me his father's diaries, maps and photographs from that time.
This is a picture of my father in North Russia, in Archangel, and wearing the Shuba fur.
It's huge. He looks
yes,
huge,
it's
doesn't
huge.
He? And who's that, a little boy?
And that is just to show you how big he was compared with a child.
Yeah, he's like a big wall of fur.
Yeah.
I asked Lord Ironside, what kind of a country did his father find when he arrived in Russia?
Englishmen didn't know what life in Russia was like. They'd heard about it, but they didn't really know what it was like. And in any case, politically speaking, things were changing for the worse, as we know. The average Russian citizen had got tired of the Tsarist governments and their grandeur, and there was a lot of grandeur, and it was a political feeling that they were tired of the Tsarist governments. This is what made communism come to life.
General Ironside realised his men were confused about their mission in Russia from the very start. In an address to his troops in October 1918, he tried to set them straight. "We're up against Bolshevism," he said, which means anarchy, pure and simple.
There are people who insist that the entire intervention was always motivated by military concerns, and they dismiss the idea that there was a conscious attempt to suppress the Bolshevik Revolution. I don't personally find that convincing.
Ironside, a bluff, pragmatic character, was the inspiration for Richard Hannay, hero of the spy thriller The 39 Steps. He believed his role was to restore order, but on the battlefields around Archangel, his tiny army of not very first-class troops, as he described them, were dying every day. And the foreign soldiers and the White Russians who fought alongside them faced another enemy, the cold.
But here gives you some idea of what the cold did.
How many men got frostbite up there?
Hundreds. It was common and easy to get. A lot of the people who got it were not British. They were Russian.
At the 11th hour, on November the 11th, 1918, World War I was finally at an end. After 4 long years, millions of people took to the streets to celebrate the armistice between Germany and the Allies. But in North Russia, the fighting only intensified.
In autumn 1918, when the armistice was signed on the Western Front of the First World War, the First World War was over. They wanted to go home. What are they doing in this distant northern country among the snows? And what are they fighting for, or against whom they are fighting now here? That's why we can see that over time disappointment grows very fast.
Here in the forest of Yemstvo, a stop on the railway south of Archangel, the fighting between intervention troops and the Bolsheviks was at its most ferocious during the bitter winter of 1918 to 19. In the summer, the troops were tormented by swarms of blood-sucking mosquitoes. Traces of these hard-fought battles are still found in the earth today.
И туда. Впервые в этот лес мы пришли 10 лет назад, в 2007 году. Вот, обнаружили остатки укреплений, целый оборонительный район, и поняли, что здесь нужно работать, здесь интересно, здесь много нового, и здесь та война, которую практически никто не знает.
Alexei Sukhanovsky is a local journalist, but his true passion is battlefield archaeology. He spends his weekends in the forest with his friends, uncovering evidence of this forgotten war.
Таких снарядов было выпущено много и стреляли каждый день. Каждый день.
С какого числа до какого числа?
Здесь война шла с 14 октября 1918 года до 29 августа 1919 года. То есть фактически год здесь каждый день стреляли. То есть весь лес этой железной щепой усыпан.
Почти всюду,
Ну
да?
вот мы ходим и беспрерывно вот прибор срабатывает на металл. То есть везде под нами вот лежат такие осколки, большие, маленькие. Что, двигаемся дальше.
Спасибо.
Alexei and his friends have recently discovered an underground American dugout that the troops used as a shelter against the relentless battles and the harsh climate.
I'm going into a dugout and there's actually snow in here. That's what you call an Archangel summer. Oops, it's quite narrow. We've just climbed into a dugout made by American troops more than 100 years ago, and on the way down here I had to scramble over snow, even though it's July. It's amazing to think that they were under here in 1918 trying to escape from Bolshevik shells and artillery. And the only thing that I can say about this place that's positive is there are no mosquitoes.
Мы нашли 7 человек вот за 10 лет работы в этом лесу. Вот, 3 из них были белыми солдатами, солдатами белой армии, и 4 красноармейцами. Вот. Если белые погибли в бою и были зарыты не очень глубоко в землю в снарядной воронке, Вот. 2 человека были раздеты до нога при этом, на них не было никакой одежды. Вот. А один был в шинели, изрубленный вот такими осколками так, что шинель уже была непригодна. Вот. Нашли 2 пулеметчиков красноармейцев. Вот. Вот они погибли прямо на позиции. И неподалеку нашли одного красноармейца. Он, видимо, либо его догнали в лесу и убили, либо его уже вывели из строя пленных, вот, и убили уже в стороне, потому что у него было характерное ранение смертельное. Его ударили прикладом винтовки в голову. Он упал, его даже не закопали, он так и остался лежать.
Правда?
Да.
Alexei's built a chapel in the forest to the memory of the dead from both sides, the Reds, the Whites and the foreigners who fought alongside them. He and his friends have reburied the bodies they've found. It's not just in the forest that you find scars from this century-old war. We're sailing down the river Dvina from Archangel, or Arkhangelsk in Russian, to reach one of the most shameful sites of the Allied intervention.
One of the very first things that the Allied troops did when they got here, within the first month in fact, was set up a prison camp. It was on an island called Mudyug, about 50 miles from Arkhangelsk out in the White Sea. And as you can imagine, it did very little to endear the foreigners to the local population.
100 years ago, the city prison in Archangel was chronically overcrowded. The Allies decided to send suspected Bolshevik sympathizers to the far-off island of Mudyug.
Here they were Red prisoners of war. Here they were members of Soviet grassroots popular organizations, many of whom sympathized with the Bolsheviks, but not all of them, who were kept here on a distant island so that they cannot interfere with the White campaign and with the Allied campaign against the Bolsheviks.
We're being plagued by mosquitoes here today, but otherwise it's a lovely summer afternoon. I just can't imagine what it would be like, though, to be here when it's something like -30, when the sea is frozen, when there's ice on the floor of the barracks. I just wonder how people survived at all.
The guards were White Russians, but most of the officers were French. About 1,000 people, civilians, political prisoners and prisoners of war, were sent here. Hundreds perished from hunger and disease. In winter, temperatures plunged to -50. Some inmates were kept in the dreaded ice cells overnight. It was a merciless regime.
I think it makes life very, very cheap. And I think killing somebody either through starving them, through allowing them to freeze to death or to get such severe frostbite that they lose limbs, I think this is normal. It's what happens in war, and people on all sides lost any sense of humanity.
There is first-hand testimony about the Mudyug camp from the radical journalist Pavel Raskazov, who was imprisoned on the island and later wrote his memoirs. He recalled one French officer in particular who'd had a very different role at the court of Nicholas II. His family had been supplying soap and perfume to the Tsars for generations.
Lieutenant Bohr was the counterintelligence officer in this chamber of torture and humiliation. A former successful entrepreneur from Moscow, he was of medium height, stout, with a round, fat face which looked like a bulldog. The camp for the prisoners of war in Mudyug operated under his parental guidance.
И находился лагерь военнопленных на острове Мудюге.
Other prisoners remember the French lieutenant as an elegantly dressed solitary figure who used to take long walks along the White Sea. And there's a bizarre twist to this tale. By 1920, Lieutenant Beau had fled Russia for the south of France. There he met Coco Chanel and invented the world's best-selling perfume, Chanel No. 5, loosely inspired by his time in the Russian Arctic.
Coco Chanel calls upon Ernest Beau, perfumer to the Tsars. In search of inspiration, Ernest Beau ventures as far as the Arctic Circle, finding his muse in the exhilarating air issuing from the northern lakes under the midnight sun.
If Ernest Beau found the aromas of Mudyug inspiring, Marina Titova senses something very different in the air.
Очень страшно, очень жутко, и несмотря на то, что все события происходили практически 100 лет назад уже, все равно такая гнетущая атмосфера смерти, она здесь, я думаю, сохранилась.
Marina has never visited the island before. She's come to find out more about the fate of her great-great-uncle Fyodor Aparin, a local builder who is imprisoned here.
Он ушел на Первую мировую войну, был ранен очень серьезно, и уже потом, после войны, вернулся на свою родину, вот, в деревню Кичишна в Архангельской области. Там он женился, у него есть жена, у него родилась маленькая дочка. Его сослали на Мудюг именно за то, что он был председателем исполкома, за то, что он агитировал местных жителей вступать в ряды Красной армии, за то, что считал себя большевиком.
By the time Fyodor Aparin arrived on Mudyug on the 22nd of August 1919, the prison camp was under White Russian control. The Allies had left in June because they were so worried about the scandalous conditions there. On the 15th of September, Aparin tried to escape.
По первой версии он пытался бежать, однако по причине ослабленного здоровья он не смог это сделать и был застрелен именно во время побега. И вот уже другая версия этой смерти, то, что он во время самого побега все-таки не погиб, он был расстрелян уже на следующий день, то есть в ночь 16 на 17 сентября, в числе 13 заключенных.
The imprisoned journalist Pavel Raskazov witnessed the execution of these men and wrote about it in his prison memoirs.
Их было 13 человек.
There were 13 of them, weak, physically exhausted by their imprisonment. 100 steel bayonets ominously wavered in the dusk. They walked out of the prison gate, turned left to the sea, and spread out along the barbed wire. The machine gun was brought in. The condemned men were lined up on the sandy hill, with their backs to the sea. And now we could see their grey figures clearly against the dying, pale dusk. We could hear the sound of the sea, the waves washing quietly over the flat sandbank. Tra-ta-ta-ta-ta! The shots rang out suddenly, startling the quietness of the approaching night and echoing somewhere far into the wood.
Marina is laying 2 red carnations in memory of her relative and his comrades on the little memorial dedicated to those who died on Mudyug.
После того, как я возложила цветы, пошел дождь. То есть это, не знаю, может быть, это простое совпадение, но для меня это своеобразный привет из прошлого, что, может быть, эти люди, эти узники, которые здесь страдали, пытались выжить, они услышали, они видят, что их помнят о том, что здесь происходило. Поэтому это такой очень важный для меня момент побывать именно здесь.
Back Back home in Britain, the Allied intervention in Russia was increasingly unpopular. The war was over, and people were asking, why are our boys still fighting in a far-off land and seemingly against our former allies? Trade unions passed hands-off Russia resolutions at their meetings, and daily newspapers wrote that the frozen plains of Eastern Europe are not worth the bones of a single grenadier. Debates on the intervention were held in Parliament. The British Prime Minister Lloyd George felt under pressure to bring the troops back home. Churchill lobbied unsuccessfully for reinforcements to be sent to Russia. His Prime Minister, worried about the unrest at home and the growing expense, refused.
Lloyd George had serious doubts about it, particularly because of the likely domestic repercussions. The Labour Party was against intervention. There was great sort of relief at the end of the war. People did not want to see Britain continue to be involved in military operations.
По части интервенции согласия в Англии тоже не было. Вот. Одни были за, другие были против. Ну, а когда такой раздрай, такое непонимание, чего мы хотим, это обернулось тем, что войска Антанты сюда пришли и, в общем-то, безрезультатно ушли.
The protests in America against the intervention were even more heated. Ordinary people were outraged that their relatives were still fighting overseas. They wanted them home. The American president, Woodrow Wilson, joined Lloyd George in proposing a ceasefire in Russia and a peace conference. The Bolsheviks accepted, but the whites refused.
Lloyd George didn't overrule Churchill until well into 1919, when finally he and the other Allied leaders said, this is getting nowhere. And Lloyd George said, hey, you've been doing this for 6-8 months now, and it's not working. In fact, militarily, the British were actually getting defeated.
General Ironside confided to his diary that he no longer knew what he was doing in Russia.
All the fighting that he did out there had no result, and so the decision was reached by the War Office and everybody to withdraw the troops.
In late September, the last Allied troops sailed back home, leaving the citizens of Archangel to their fate. Yevgenia Fraser, who was 13, remembers a deep sense of foreboding in her family about the future. How long would it be before the Bolsheviks took control of their city?
By the autumn of 1919, all these ships were going back. They had no reason to stay. The war was over. And as far as the Russian fighting between the Red and Whites, well, they were not concerned very much with that. This was, I would say, maybe 8 o'clock or so in the morning, and we saw them going away. And I always remember my uncle saying, why did they come at all? We shall pay for this. And we did.
After the Allies left, middle-class families like Yevgenia's did indeed suffer.
When Archangel fell to the invading Red forces, life became very difficult for us. We suffered searches, others were arrested. Our neighbours' children, their father was a colonel in the Russian White Army. He was one of the first to be executed. And they were the children who joined our gang after, We weren't interested in politics being young. We were more interested in what we could find to eat.
Along with her mother and brother, Yevgenia got out of Archangel on the very last ship to leave in 1920. They settled in Scotland, but her grandfather was locked up and later killed by the Bolsheviks, and she never saw her father or the rest of her family again. Russia descended further into civil war. Nobody knows the full human cost of the conflict. but by any calculation it was catastrophic. An estimated 10 million lives were lost through the fighting, the terror, the famine and disease.
Война началась, и когда, и это тем более гражданская война, в ней ни брода, как в России говорят, ни переправ, ни края нет. То есть это война, которая порождает только ожесточение той и другой стороны. Потому что если мы начнем исследовать, кто был более жестокий, то это бессмысленно.
White terror was more pragmatic. They wanted to win the war. They wanted to kill those who undermined their effort. They didn't care about eliminating their enemies totally. It was quite different on the red side because the Reds were waging a war against the old regime. There were whole classes that were perceived as enemies, and that's why the scale of terror was much, much larger.
After the October Revolution, Lenin had appointed Mikhail Kedrov as the head of the secret police, or the Cheka, in the Archangel region. Lenin had reprimanded Kedrov for leaving the city in the summer of 1918 and allowing the Allied forces to enter. In an angry telegram, the Bolshevik leader urged him to make up for lost time. Kedrov soon became notorious for his brutality.
Kedrov was certainly not some thuggish person who had risen through the ranks by virtue of being a tough guy and someone not afraid of violence. He was a trained doctor and he was a fine pianist and generally a very, very cultured person. Why somebody like him then becomes this extremely ruthless, merciless Chekist, I think is quite hard to understand.
Кедров был чекистом. Людей не только расстреливали, да, людей еще топили в баржах. То есть плывут, вот, например, да, думают, что едут куда-то в лагерь, в тюрьму, топили баржи в глубоких местах на Двине и на Пиниге.
One of the places where the Red Terror was unleashed was the peaceful 17th century convent of Holmagori, southeast of Archangel. Once the Red Army arrived in February of 1920, mass executions of those branded counter-revolutionaries began. The nuns had to mop up the blood.
Вот у нас в истории Холмогор была такая очень трагическая страница. Это было действительно 100 лет назад. Здесь на территории старинного женского Успенского монастыря лагерь принудительных работ. Самая страшная считается тюрьма России.
Red Terror was probably much harsher. In Holmagori, we know that somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000 were killed just on one spot, just in one monastery.
Начальником лагеря был назначен очень человек жестокий, пьющий, психически неуравновешенный Иосиф Бачулис, который любил вот такое своеобразное развлечение. Он, например, на свою дачу, бывший монастырский скит, приглашал гостей с дамами со своими. Они устраивали соревнования по стрельбе из пулемета. То есть одни заключенные, копали яму, другие вставали вдоль этой ямы и их расстреливали. И человеческие трупы по несколько дней не убирали. То есть такое зловоние было страшное. Да? Пытались их сжигать, но сжигание процесс очень длительный, тела человеческие плохо горят. И впоследствии их закапывали. Везде, повсюду здесь можно наткнуться на человеческие останки.
Holmagori was not the only place where such savage acts were committed. The Red Terror orchestrated by the Cheka was in evidence throughout Russia.
The dynamic of civil war, which I think is always one that tends towards barbarism, these things mean very quickly the Cheka is outside any frame of law, a culture of acceptance of violence, a culture of killing, becomes its own, it has its own dynamic that people no longer think about. Whether it matters if you kill the families of people who are fighting on the other side. They are marked by their association.
Fighting between the Reds and the Whites lasted until 1921, when the Bolsheviks gained control of the whole country, and a year later the USSR was born.
The civil war in Russia was a very tricky period of time. Later on, historians try to evaluate why the Reds won and why the Whites lost, as if it was predetermined from the very beginning. But if we look at the turning points, at the advances of the Whites, it seems to me that there were periods of time when the Whites were quite close to success. And if they had just a few more luck on their side, the history of this country could have taken a different way.
Did the intervention act as a catalyst for the fratricidal bloodshed that followed? Some are convinced that the Civil War would never have happened if the Allies had only stayed at home.
Надо понимать, что приходя в чужую страну с оружием, ты порождаешь в любом случае насилие. Ты создаешь преференции одной стороне, сопротивляться которым будет другая сторона. А это порождает внутреннее насилие, раздрай, дезорганизацию и распад. К хорошему это не ведет. То есть, на мой взгляд, если бы не было интервенции, то не было бы и гражданской войны. То есть полномасштабной войны, в которую вылилась интервенция и гражданская война с применением тяжелой артиллерии, с применением авиации, танков, химического оружия, этого бы, скорее всего, не было.
The Civil War had dynamics that were fundamentally not about reaction to what the Allies did. The Allies found themselves, I think, increasingly drawn into the logic of civil war, the logic of using any means possible in order to quash the enemy.
То есть сказать, что причина всей гражданской войны была в интервентах, конечно же, нет. У нас своих хватало вообще-то мерзавцев и подлецов. У нас память короткая очень, как-то так забылась. Это все забылось. И вот сейчас разговариваешь с людьми, получается, что очень многие, они и не знают, что здесь был лагерь смерти. Не знают. И сказать, что какой-то есть большой интерес, нет. Их больше интересует, вот, когда вот колокола поднимали на колокольню. Надо же ведь понять, почему это случилось, да? Дать какую-то оценку, какие-то последствия после этого события. Нет.
At the end of the Civil War, the Soviets buried their dead, but not their memories. Many saw the wars of intervention as the beginning of the Cold War. In the West, they were an embarrassment, something to be brushed under the carpet. In the East, they were used as a propaganda tool against the capitalists.
The official narrative in the Soviet Union was one that I think it emerged very, very early. 14 powers intervened in order to crush our revolution. And the Bolsheviks were able to play on that very curiously, because although their language was primarily about class struggle, it was an appeal to the international working class to make revolution and to overthrow the privileged classes, paradoxically, the fact of invasion helped to mobilise patriotism, helped to mobilise national resistance.
Under Stalin, the memory of the intervention continued to rankle. He'd purged most of the instigators of the Red Terror in the north. Kedrov was shot in his prison cell in 1941.
And all the world's been waiting for months to see what would happen when the leaders of these two great power blocs met face to face. Dwight D. Eisenhower, head of the United States, and Nikita Khrushchev, undisputed boss of the Soviet Union.
In 1959, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev embarked on his Cold War roadshow tour of the USA. At a lunch in Hollywood, apparently annoyed by the State Department's veto of his visit to Disneyland, he told his American hosts that he remembered the grim days of the intervention.
Это самое неприятное явление, которое было между нашими странами. Потому что никогда мы до этого не воевали с Америкой. Никогда наши солдаты не были на земле американской, а ваши солдаты были на земле советской.
Three decades later, for the 70th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, the then leader Mikhail Gorbachev told the Supreme Soviet the intervention, along with World War I and the Civil War, was a painful episode on the long road to socialism.
Товарищи, наш путь первопроходцев огромен и сложен. Его кратким анализом не охватишь и не обнимешь. И тяжесть материального и нравственного наследия старого мира, Первой мировой и гражданской войн, интервенции.
Over the last 100 years, the intervention has coloured Russia's relations with the West. The mission-turned-misadventure helped to create a fear of encirclement and an intense distrust of the West, especially present in Russia today.
Мы помним о трагедии 2 мировых войн, об уроках истории. Они не дают нам ослепнуть. За новыми угрозами проступают все те же старые уродливые черты: эгоизм и нетерпимость, агрессивный национализм и претензии на исключительность. Мы понимаем всю серьезность этих угроз.
President Vladimir Putin devoted half of his State of the Union address this year to the modernizing of Russia's nuclear arsenal. Obelisks like this one on the prison camp island of Mudyug were erected to the memory of Bolsheviks who'd been tortured by the foreign invaders. It became a popular tourist destination in Soviet times.
It was a sacred place in a sense, part of the foundation myth of the Soviet regime, because the patriotic workers and sailors and peasants, they fought against, as they pictured, the whole capitalist world. They managed to repel all the attacks by the Western imperialists and their troops. And it was here that a lot of school children came, and a lot of excursions from factories came to see that monument here and to get proud of the Soviet achievements.
Although Marina is from Archangel, she's never had a chance to visit before we came.
Ни один из моих друзей, знакомых, из родственников, они тут не были. Более того, многие даже не слышали никогда об этом острове, об этом лагере. И вот, наверное, в планах на будущее, в первую очередь, привезти сюда свою семью, своих близких, особенно родственников, вот именно Федора Опарина.
Now the museum on Mudyug lies abandoned.
На данный момент и история интервенции лагерей у нас на севере, она, к сожалению, забыта. И, наверное, рассказать своим друзьям об этой странице в истории нашей страны.
Hundreds of Allied soldiers died here. The British graves in this Archangel War Cemetery are well kept, but rarely visited. Most of the American dead were repatriated. Invading Russia rarely goes well. It's a lesson painfully learned by both Napoleon and Hitler, and by General Ironside. The bear of a man nicknamed Tiny later saw action in Turkey and Iraq and commanded troops in France and Scandinavia during World War II. But when he was given a peerage in 1941, he took the title of Lord Ironside of Archangel, an Ironside in the county of Aberdeen. The memory of his time in North Russia never left him.
At the time he chose the title, people didn't know where Archangel was.
Yes.
That's very true, very true. But to him, it was his moment of truth, moment of truth.
But the mission was a failure.
The mission was a failure.